What is up, everybody? My name is Raymond Summerlin. This is the Sharp Angles podcast, and I am joined by the man who joins me every Thursday, the Swami of Konami, as I'm going to keep bringing back, Mr. Rich Rhibar. How are you doing, Rich?
Oh man, we are cooking. It's like mid-July now. I mean, we're 14 days away from like kind of all these teams kind of being in training camp, and then the Hall of Fame games like 3 weeks away. Like it's like we're really circling, we're rounding the corner here.
I'm literally cooking because I live in Texas and it's been over 100 degrees for I think all of my life, at least for the last month. It's been over 100
Do you
degrees.
even go
I got in.
outside like on a day like this? Do you...
I try not to. There is somebody who was very recently mowing in the right in front of my house. One of my neighbors was mowing, which is a decision. That's a heck of a decision to make in the middle of the day in Texas. So hopefully we won't hear that. The only time I go outside is to get into the pool, and the pool is essentially bathwater at this point. So it really there's not much relief that comes from dipping into 90-degree water. So yeah, mostly you just stay inside, you pay the high electric bill, you hope that the grid doesn't crash as it tends to do in Texas, and you just play it by ear. At least I live in Central Texas. It's not so humid, not like it is up there in Ohio sometimes. So we're not feeling bad.
Yeah, I visited. My mom lives in like right outside of Fort Myers, and we went, and it was 110 degrees at like 9:30 in the morning. I'm like, what are we even supposed to do today? Like, what are you even supposed to do? Like, just misery. It's like I guess we're going to the movies.
Well, I'm going to Orlando the last week in July too, and we're going to walk
Oh,
around, the Harry Potters and the Star Wars, and so we'll see. We'll see how that goes.
God
So I
bless
might
you.
die. That'll be fun for everybody. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're going to talk today about a really interesting article series that Rich has published on sharpfootballanalysis.com, a great website. He's published this week looking back at 2022 and kind of how offenses changed, how the running back position changed, how quarterback changed, all of that kind of moving into 2023. And more importantly, what are some takeaways that we can have going into 2023? He does this series every single year. It is absolutely fantastic. Head over to the website and read it. On the website, the kind of offensive look back is free, so everybody can read that. The rest of it is part of the Sharp Fantasy Football Draft Kit, which you can get for just $1, thanks to our friends at Underdog. If you go to the website, Sharp Football Analysis, there are instructions on there about how you get the $1 offer. I believe that there will also be a link in the show description, so go and click there. It's really easy to get the offer. It's really easy to get some of the best fantasy football writing for only $1 this offseason. So go and do that. All of Rich's content is in there. That's the stuff you want to read. I also have some content in there. You can just go ahead and ignore that. But you'll get all of Rich's stuff for $1. So that's definitely something that you should do. But I want to get started with actually the free article, just looking back at offense and kind of how it changed in 2022. And I think one of the interesting things going back in this series a couple of years, because like I said, you've been writing it for a while, is we saw a massive offensive spike coming out of the pandemic years,
Right.
2020, 2021. And we kind of expected a little bit of a fall off as defenses, started to catch up. But we saw a pretty big fall off last year, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that you want to acknowledge firsthand before we start to like talk about some of like the different kind of changes like defenses made to slow down offenses, was that this was kind of like the first, like, air quotes, normal kind of football season, because of
Yeah.
2020 was obviously, historically different and was the largest scoring season in NFL history. What's interesting is like the Kelsey brothers just talked about it on a podcast like 2 weeks ago too, about how unique that season was, like not playing in front of fans, how you could just, go and like hear everything in the game that was going on. And like all the stats bear out in that 2020 season, like road performances like were all-time high, like just how offense performed on the road, in the red zone on the road, like false start penalties were historically down. And those are all things that inherently make sense with no crowds. We did get crowds in 2021, but like COVID still was like had a massive impact. I mean, just on rosters. In December alone of that 2021 season, there's over 500 players that went on the COVID list. So like last year, just removing those like elements where like COVID really didn't have its like thumbprint, played a large impact. And then we saw like immediately scoring drop. Now, it wasn't just because of COVID, but no one really kind of looked at those 2 seasons and like kind of really ever talked about like how the pandemic was influencing fantasy football. It was something I always just tried to keep like notes on and try to keep everyone in like hindsight. Cause I expected some regression last year, but like not like last year where we really had the fall came swift. It was literally the worst offensive season since 2017 in a lot of categories. And from a passing stance, it was the worst passing season the NFL's had literally since like 2010, 2009, 2008. So all of those things kind of in unison kind of came into play. And we'll talk about some of like the changes defense made.
Yeah, I think that it was a mixture of 2 things, which is really interesting. Coming out of those super high offensive years, and like you mentioned, it makes sense that if the home field advantage disappears and you don't have crowds causing false start penalties and things like that, that you're going to see more offensive performance. And so coming out of that 2020 season, coming out of the 2021 season, like I think that it was expected that we might see a little bit of offensive drop off. But like you said, it wasn't just that kind of natural regression that was happening. The defenses actually made changes. They were changing how they were approaching
Right.
these offenses. And I think it got talked about a lot in 2021, actually, when we started to think about how teams were defending the Bills and how teams were defending the Chiefs and how they were trying to, when Tyreek Hill still played for the Chiefs, take away a lot of those deep shots. But that just continued to move through the league. And they started, even the non-elite passing offenses, as happens in the NFL, this is a copycat league, they started to kind of take on some of those defensive tendencies, right?
Yeah, I mean, you started to hear about it, like you said, in 2021, the too high safety, right? Like even my grandma
Yeah, there
started
you
talking
go.
about too high safeties. We heard that like cover 2, like literally was just invented in 2021. Like,
Well, thanks, Vic Fangio. I really do appreciate you coming in and ruining fantasy football. It is funny to think about. I actually pulled up some numbers on this. I don't have any numbers back before 2020, and so we started. That's kind of the year we started to see this and more in 2021. And you have seen too high coverage, really middle of the field open coverage. You have seen that go up steadily over the past several seasons. And like you said, this isn't like a new defense. This was the way defense was played in the early 2000s. Those great Bears defense, the great
Monty
Bucks
Kiffin,
defense,
the Monty
Monty
Kiffin
Kiffin,
life.
exactly. Tampa too. Like it's played a little bit differently. There are fewer players in the box, and the kind of rules around it and the rotations are different. So it's not the same idea, but like it's not like too high safeties was a completely new thing, but it did go away, right? Because of the NFL, the ebbs and flows. Pete Carroll comes in, brings in the single high coverage, and teams want to copy that. Most of them copied it poorly, but that's still what they wanted to do. And so, yeah, it's not a new thing, but if your offense has for, let's say, a decade been built around how do we beat this kind of cover 3, cover 1 types of defenses, when you start seeing a different type of defense, it's going to take you a little bit to adjust to that. The Chiefs, because they saw it in 2021, and there's a lot of great stuff about this in Warren Sharp's 2023 preview book, which, by the way, is available. Early bird pricing is still available now. Go to sharpfootballanalysis.com, get it for only $30. You won't regret that you do. But there's a lot of great stuff in there about how the Chiefs figured it out. And the Chiefs were amazing against every kind of defense last year because they saw it in 2021 and they were able to adjust in 2022. And it'll be interesting to see if the whole league kind of catches up moving forward, and if 2022 was more of a dip than the start of a longer trend. That'll be something that I think will be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and the league is cyclical. Like these things tend to have an ebb and flow. You get it's like a boxing match, right? Defenses start to see like, hey, offenses want to do X, Y, and Z. How do we take those away and make them do something else? And offenses are going to obviously probably calibrate and find things that break these defenses, and it's just going to kind of be that cat and mouse game. But if you look at it last year, I mean, just to put some numbers to it, I mean, defenses were a nickel and dime at 73.7% of all snaps last season. It's by far the most in NFL history. Teams used 4-man fronts on the defensive line for just 40.8% of snaps. That was an all-time low. And you see like those things kind of correlate to how, why the NFL, they had the lowest drop back rate since 2011. Running the ball was kind of back. We'll kind of get into that because it's still not as advantageous as passing. So it's that's where I'm curious where the cat and mouse game goes, right? Because like the answer is to kind of run the ball against these lighter fronts that we're seeing at historic level, but it still is helping the defense if you do that. Even the best runs are not as good as some of the worst passes. But we've seen like it's not just the coverage that teams are playing too, but it's just the frequency of less aggressiveness, right? Because there was a difference like when those Monty Kiffin defenses were playing a lot of coverage, but they were able to get after the quarterback and they were sending still a lot of blitzes. But I mean, the man coverage rate is just dropping off. The blitz rate is dropping off in the NFL, and like staggering man coverage rates. Like, you know, we only have at True Media like 3 years of access to like man coverage rates, but it's not just like slowly going down. Like, you know, it was 30.8% in 2020, then it went to 27.9% in 2021. Just 24.4% of plays last year. Like we're talking like 3% jumps every year. Like it's pretty wild. Obviously there's going to be like a dead cat bounce at some point, but just the teams are just not playing aggressive defense right now. And it's forced offenses to kind of condense their passing tree. We're seeing the lowest amount of deep passes in the NFL. We're seeing the most passes at or behind the line of scrimmage in NFL history. ADOTs are just plummeting. You got to win with yak, and you know the quarterback's getting rid of the football. But yeah, it's really interesting to see how the defenses have approached into forcing offenses to kind of run the football more, and who's going to acquiesce and say like, yeah, we're just not going to do that. Because the Bengals were one of those teams last year.
Yeah, I think that you kind of hit a little bit of this. Part of it is going to be more running. And we saw that a little bit. I mean, we've talked about that on this podcast before, that the Bears and the Falcons had off pass rates under expected that were so far under expected that they were like the worst rates that we've seen in the last decade. And so you saw that kind of switch. But it is interesting that that's not what we saw from the Chiefs. And I keep coming back to the Chiefs because they actually experience a lot of this. The Chiefs just threw the ball shorter and were very efficient because they have Patrick Mahomes. And so they were able to throw the ball shorter. They were able to throw the ball more around the line of scrimmage and behind the line of scrimmage. And they were able to still get those, still get that passing efficiency just by changing the way they move. And so I think it will be interesting to see. And you brought this up in your series, looking at kind of beyond the line of scrimmage throws and behind the line of scrimmage throws, is how are we going to continue to get the players that we actually want to catch the ball? Because running backs catching the ball, even the best running backs that aren't named Christian McCaffrey, catching the ball behind the line of scrimmage is generally not the way that you want to do things, right? But I think that if we can continue to get wide receivers around there, preferably wide receivers not named Curtis Samuel, because that doesn't seem to be working out great for him right now. Deebo Samuel, though, we can get him around the line of scrimmage. It's going to be interesting to see, I think, how that changes a little bit too.
Yeah, I put a couple of those charts in there that shows like the league-wide target distribution, like at and behind the line of scrimmage and beyond the line of scrimmage. And it's interesting that, throws increasingly are thrown at or behind the line of scrimmage at a higher rate than ever before, but like running back receptions just continue to plummet, right? It's because like
they're not efficient. Like, right. And coaches, and that's the thing that I think we saw. We talked about this a lot at the draft time. Front offices and coaches are becoming much smarter. That they are using the numbers to a much greater advantage in the past. And so we're seeing, you brought up basketball. I think it's a great comparison. The math is pretty simple. 3 is more than 2, right? But it took the NBA a long time to figure out kind of the percentages and how that works. You make a third of your 3-pointers, that's as good as making half of your 2-pointers. It's simple math, right? We're seeing that kind of thing show up here. And I like that you brought it up with running, even if it were better at running, and we can get to that, the NFL was as a whole last year, you're still gaining fewer yards per run than you are gaining yards per pass. And so yards per pass are still, more advantageous. Throwing to wide receivers is more advantageous. And so I think that might be the overarching trend we have here. Defensive coaches are getting smarter at how they defend, but offensive coaches also are as well. And so we're seeing kind of the efficiency kind of movement happen in the NFL, which it's interesting to see where that goes. Will people like Arthur Smith push back on that? That will be really kind of fascinating to see.
Yeah, I mean, EPA per dropback was, it hit a snag. It was all-time low last year since 2017, and the second lowest of the past decade. But if you still get like EPA per run, It was the highest it's ever been, over
Yeah.
that sample, and still wasn't as good as EPA per dropback. So I mean,
Was negative, right? It was still
yeah,
negative league wide.
still negative. QB runs positive, which I think is pretty interesting, and that's like the element of the game that I think has really changed versus like where we were maybe 15 years ago when all this coverage and stuff existed, and then the NFL counterpunch. Like I think that's the big element is like the QB mobility stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because teams are inviting defense or offenses to run, and they did it more at a higher rate last year. But you still want to be throwing the football. And like I said, the Bengals are the one team. Like if you look at like, Justin Herbert takes a lot of flack for his ADOT last year, and I think a lot of that was manipulated. That's not solely Joe Lombardi's fault, but like you look at the Bengals, like you never hear anything about Joe Burrow's ADOT, right? It was just as bad because of the style of defenses everybody played. But what did they do? They started using Jamar Chase in a completely different fashion than they did as his rookie season, and they're able to get him a lot more targets near the line of scrimmage. He's really great after the catch. And they just still didn't really run the football out. Like their pass rate over expectation was amongst the league's best. It was amongst the league's best on 1st and 10s. And they weren't just lining up and saying, all right, we're getting these light boxes. We're going to do it. One, because Joe Mixon was terrible running against light boxes, even as it was. But,
great.
But you're able to still throw the football against these defenses in that way. So I'm curious to see like what teams kind of adjust. You don't have to go the full Falcons Bears route.
Never go full Falcons. Is that what we're?
Yeah. Well,
as we know in this podcast, you hate the Falcons. So
it's documented.
That's documented. That's on the record. Everybody knows that. I do like the man coverage and blitzing part of it. I do think it's interesting that like the teams that were still high man coverage, Wink comes to mind. Those defenses still kind of got roasted last year, and we'll see a lot of that go away. Miami now has Vic Fangio, right? And so we're going to see kind of what they're doing change as well. And so I think that that's an interesting part. You brought up the kind of quarterback rushing aspect of things. And I think that is, as you mentioned, that's an interesting part of it, because when you started talking about quarterback runs, whenever they started to become, much more prevalent, I guess in the 2000s in high schools and college, and then, moving on to the NFL, then you always were talking about the numbers advantage. And as you brought up, teams now have fewer men on the defensive line. They have fewer people along the defensive line. And so when you're running quarterback runs, you have an even stronger numbers advantage. And you pointed out some stats in your article that I thought were fascinating about how not only are quarterback runs efficient, we're seeing a lot more of them. And that's probably a trend that's going to continue.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is like we don't really have kind of a grasp of like where like the ceiling is for this types of stuff. I mean, even last year, if you look at just all the rushing attempts in the NFL, quarterbacks still only accounted for 15.8%. It was the most in league history, but like 15%, when you hear 15%, it's not like a huge number to you, right? Designed rushing attempts, because scrambles make up a large portion of that. Quarterbacks only accounted for 7%. Again, the most in league history, but 7%, like we've got a long way to go to find out like where does like the wall on this. And we're only getting more of an influx of mobile quarterbacks and more athletic quarterbacks in the NFL. Anthony Richardson's going to start games this year. We add Bryce Young, we add CJ Stroud. Will Levis is athletic. We got rid of Tom Brady. We got rid of Matt Ryan. Like we're just getting more athletes at the position. So
that sounds so mean.
It does, it does. But and I don't want to say like the pocket passer is dead, but like, because we're just not seeing a lot of Mac Jones prospects, right? Like almost every prospect is athletic now because human evolution. These guys are bigger, faster, stronger. So your quarterback's able to do more things than he was, when Dan Marino came out in the 80s, and there was like these guys were in short supply and they only came around once in a while. We're even getting bad versions of these guys that just kind of wash out, because you still do have to throw eventually in the NFL.
Kenny Pickett's such a fun example of that, right? Like the archetype of who Kenny Pickett might be coming out of Pitt, but like he's athletic, he can run. Like it's I think that Kenny Pickett in 1985 coming out of Pitt, you would think about him a lot differently than you do than you do now. And I think that's kind of the idea, is that it's such an advantage that every quarterback needs to be able to do this. And there will be exceptions. There will be Mac Jones, right? There will be exceptions to this rule. But every quarterback's going to need to be able to do that, even if you're the best passing quarterback in the league. Even if you're Patrick Mahomes, the best passing quarterback in the league, Patrick Mahomes still, and we take this to fantasy, average something like 3.5 fantasy points per game with his legs, right? And he's been doing that consistently. It's such an important part of winning as an NFL offense.
And
And
like I
we're
said, the
just going to,
Bengals, look at Joe Burrow as the season went on last year. Look at his rushing. It's not like he's not out here doing Jalen Hurts type things, but he's contributing in the rushing game on a regular basis. Like he's not a complete zero, in the like the QB mobility game, especially a year removed from his ACL. Like those, it's even those guys, right? Because you brought up like Mahomes, and like Mahomes isn't out here running around like crazy, but he is athletic. He's a demon at avoiding sacks. But even these guys like Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence, like these guys have mobility. It's not just like the old school like throwback, like you have to be Mike Vick. Like no, these guys are athletes too.
yeah. No, Trevor Lawrence is, another great one as well, because he ran a lot in college, really, and we're going to see that kind of. He's going to continue to do that as well, and so I think that this is something, and you mentioned, and I like the way you put it, is that we don't know what the cap on this is, and as we continue to see more running from quarterbacks, the effect that has on running backs in fantasy football, which is what you and I focus on a lot, begins to get very interesting, both because quarterbacks are running more, especially if those runs are scrambles, and if we continue to see the pass rates fall, that's going to take away opportunities for targets to running backs. Again, especially if wide receivers are going to start to get more of those behind the line of scrimmage and at the line of scrimmage looks. But it's also taking away. It's also going to take away, opportunities for running backs, because mobile quarterbacks just in general throw less to running backs, because if you can run on third down, or you can dump it off to a running back on third down, running on third down in a scramble when the defense isn't really paying attention to you is just a better option and tends to be, more efficient. If you're Justin Fields, do you want to check it down to Khalil Herbert, or do you just want to take off yourself? Justin Fields wants to take off himself. And so I think that talking about this kind of rise of the Russian quarterback is interesting, really, in how it affects running backs for fantasy.
Yeah, and it's something I had been thinking about for a couple of years, and it's great to put a bunch of numbers together on it, because a lot of people just talk about like the committee backfields and like the impact that's had on like this, and it combined with the era of football, we're just more pass heavy until last year. But even last year with league high rushing efficiency, rushing was as good as it's ever been in the NFL history. We have NFL teams average more yards per carry than any year, and since they've been playing football and registering stats, and we still only had 4 running backs get 20 or more touches per game. It was by far the fewest in an NFL season. So I mean, it's really like we're not getting those touches, even in a season where, like I said, rushing was as good as it's ever been. And when you start to like uncover it, it's like, well, why aren't running backs as good? Even 2 years ago, Jonathan Taylor was the lowest scoring RB1 we had since 2012. You look at last year, guys like, Nick Chubb are like, top 6 and competing with guys that are catching hundreds of passes, like the very few guys that are. It's just really wild to look at it. And you start to say, it's like, man, everything kind of comes back to the influx of mobile quarterbacks, and they're really damaging the running back position as a whole. Now, running back still accounted for 80% of all league-wide rushing attempts last year. It's a huge slice of the pie. But like when you compare that to like where we were a decade ago, it was 87%. It's like just in 10-year span, like quarterbacks have shaved 7% of the league's rushing attempts away from running backs. And for fantasy football, we care about those high value touches, right? Because not many guys are housing, runs. You're not scoring touchdowns on runs unless they come near the goal line, really. And you look at like their carries inside the 5. In 2010, running backs had 89% of the league rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. Last year, it was 74.6%. Still a huge, it's 3/4. That's like a huge chunk of the pie. But losing almost 15% of those carries is like a huge dent into fantasy football production. And then you talk about like the receptions and, running back targets per game have dropped from the year prior in 5 straight seasons. Like, again, there's going to eventually be a dead cat bounce. Like they're not going to get 0 targets per game, but the influx of mobile quarterbacks have impacted that. So we're having running backs score fewer touchdowns and catch fewer passes, which are like the holy grail fantasy stats. Like those are where all your high value and leverage weighted opportunity comes from. And running backs are having those kind of removed from them from a top down perspective. And it's really kind of troubling. And it's easy to see like why the meta has kind of shifted in fantasy football, and wide receivers have become more prevalent, especially this offseason in terms of ADP. And like the numbers all kind of bear out that just like the running back position is getting damaged by these mobile quarterbacks.
Yeah, really like the touchdown aspect of that. I was actually just writing about the Buffalo Bills, and I want to like Damian Harris. I like the kind of situation that Damian Harris is in, and he's in a good offense. He proved to be at least a league average running back in New England, facing a ton of heavy boxes, and he was still able to be successful. He'll see fewer heavy boxes, both because of league
Right.
trends and just playing for the Bills. And so I want to get in on Damian Harris, but I really am worried about, okay, can he actually have a Jamal Williams season? Like, can he actually get, not even a Jamal Williams season? Can he get 10 touchdowns? And you look at Josh Allen's usage around the goal line. And Josh Allen over the last 3 seasons has had roughly a third of the Bills' rushes in goal-to-go situations. Josh Allen has never had fewer than 6 rushing touchdowns in an NFL season. And so a large share of those available rushing touchdowns are going to go to Josh Allen, which puts a dent in the touchdown upside for Damian Harris. And that's what you're hoping for, because he's not going to catch a ton of passes, especially with James Cook there, especially because Josh Allen, although he got back up to around league average in running back target rate last year, previous to that, he hadn't really targeted running backs, and like I said, James Cook is there anyway to soak up those targets. And so if you are betting on Damian Harris, you want touchdowns. That is what's going to get you usable weeks out of Damian Harris. And if Josh Allen is taking 6 to 8 of those, then it becomes a lot less exciting to invest in him for fantasy.
Yeah, and he's kind of like he has the kind of cost where you can still kind of take on it. I think it
Yeah.
becomes more of an interesting conversation for even some guys like, I mean, Nick Chubb. Even if Deshaun Watson has 4 rushing touchdowns, that's 4 rushing touchdowns Nick Chubb didn't score, right? Like you talk about Anthony Richardson and Jonathan Taylor, like even Daniel Jones and Saquon, right?
Yeah.
Like all these guys at the front of the running back position in drafts. There is kind of a wild card. Like if Trey Lance would start, I think most of us don't believe that that's going to happen, but he could still start games for San Francisco. And like, what does that impact have on Christian McCaffrey, right? Like it's just, we haven't seen Christian McCaffrey play with Trey Lance. So like there's like that element still kind of hanging in the card. So I think when you look at like some of these running backs at the front of drafts, I think these guys that play with mobile quarterbacks, you do kind of want to pause a little bit. Just because that's ceiling production you can't get. It's not that there'll be bad draft picks. Like I don't think like if you take Nick Chubb, he's gonna like fail to the point outside of injury where you're like, oh, that ruined my season. Same thing with Jonathan Taylor, but like, do these guys have kind of like that requisite ceiling playing along that archetype of quarterback, right? And I think that's where you have to question when you're making those draft picks versus, taking Stephon Diggs or taking CeeDee Lamb, guys like that. And that's why I think that the meta has shifted and calibrated towards those wide receivers, because the inverse thing that this also does is it opens up the field of running backs. Like it makes the running back field better. And we saw that last year where zero RB became even more prevalent. And you had those hits like Jamal Williams and I'm trying to think of Ramondre Stevenson, down the line. Josh Jacobs was he became a zero RB guy because of after the preseason when he fell to like the 7th or 8th round.
Yeah.
But like what it's done is it's made the field more open at running back. So that's also allows you to wait longer because the field's drawing more live than it's ever been. It used to be like if you didn't take a running back in the first couple rounds, like you had very thin odds to land an elite running back. Now the meta has kind of shifted the last couple years where the high-end running backs aren't scoring as many points as they did a decade ago. So it's opened up the other guys to kind of gain more leverage on those top-end guys, even if you have an Austin Eckler, even if you have a Christian McCaffrey. And that's what's made it pretty interesting. And like I said, that we've seen that really impact the landscape this offseason, especially if you're drafting an underdog, because wide receivers are flying off the board.
Yeah, running backs are free on underdog. Essentially, running backs cost nothing. Like you can get starting running backs in the 18th round. That's not quite true, but it's essentially true. It's funny. We're drafting in the Scott Fish Bowl right now, and I ended up with Miles Sanders as my running back one, and I'm kind of okay with it because even if he doesn't catch a lot of passes, he's definitely the lead back on a team that was able to run the football last year. And if their guards come back healthy, has a pretty good offensive line. And I'm like, yeah, that'll be fine. He's probably not going to be elite, but how much am I really losing. And the other side of that, as you mentioned, if running backs are catching fewer passes and we have fewer guys getting these kind of elite, receiving numbers, if we don't have a bunch of guys in kind of that Alvin Kamara receiving range when he was at his absolute apex, then that does open it up for people like Nick Chubb, even with the touchdowns concerns. That opens it up for these guys that aren't going to maybe catch as many passes. Derrick Henry, although I believe he got a little more involved last year. That these guys can just hang with those other guys, even in PPR leagues, because if guys are catching fewer passes, kind of in general, then it's not as big of a detriment if you have, let's say, Brian Robinson, who might catch 10 passes, all season long.
Yeah, and we kind of seen that. Let's say like Jonathan Taylor 2 years ago, he had the fewest percentage of PPR points come from receiving for an RB1, since Adrian Peterson in 2012. It's just opened a door for those guys. Derrick Henry, a great example. Obviously, he's kind of unique because he gets so many overall touches.
Yeah.
And you got guys like Chubb, being top 6. But it also does make some of the guys that do have those receiving profiles maybe potentially undervalued, or maybe not getting the proper amount of apex range of outcomes fully cooked into their, there's a reason Rachaad White's priced where he is. There's a reason Antonio Gibson's priced where he is. We get it, but for you talking about ceiling outcomes, those are still guys that have a big apex in their range of outcomes, because they do catch a ton of passes. It gives them an edge because no one's catching a ton of passes anymore. So Jahmyr Gibbs, obviously his price is priced in, but Aaron Jones, if something were to happen to AJ Dillon, I know there's some contingency value kind of not fully cooked in, but those guys have higher ceilings than maybe accounted for. And aren't totally factored into their cost, because if they do have one of these seasons where they catch 80 passes by default, because not many guys are doing that anymore, they're going to look a lot better in hindsight.
It's funny you brought up Rachaad White, because I think that he probably has a better chance of playing with Trey Lance than Christian McCaffrey does at this point. I like that we still have to act like that's a reality, that Trey Lance would beat out Sam Darnold. Again,
he's the Shanahan's the girl on the plane. You're not real. You're not real.
You're not real. You'd never forget, by the way, every time I mention Sam Darnold's name, I have to bring up the beat writer saying he's the what was it, the best pure passer in 49ers history? Is that what was said on the radio in San Francisco?
Maybe that he's seen. I think maybe it was the one that he's seen because of the last 20 years of maybe because Jim Druckenmiller and Jeff Garcia were the best guys he saw.
Yeah, that one. CJ Beathard. All of the Nick Mullins, the great run of 49ers quarterbacks. Yeah, no, that quote will live forever with me. The kind of last position we want to hit, and this one actually published today, if you're listening to this live, on Thursday, if you're not listening to it live, and that was the wide receivers. And there were some interesting takeaways out of the wide receiver, and kind of one of the more interesting ones is while we're seeing an increase in the usage of 3 wide receivers, and that is continuing, that's kind of become the default, offensive system. 4 wide receivers, base offense, base defense. 4 wide receivers have fallen off the map, and it kind of raises some interesting fantasy takeaways.
Yeah, I had to ask the room to double check to make sure numbers the numbers were right, and had to go back on it, because the use of 4 more wide receivers absolutely just historically just dropped off last year. There was 212 dropbacks or 4 more wide receivers on the field last year. By far the fewest that I could find since True Media has been tracking this stuff. Last season, or 2021, the season prior, I should say, there were 737 dropbacks. So it went from 737 to 212. That's an absolute astronomical dip in terms of, and now Cliff Kingsbury's not in the league. So we can expect that to potentially go down as well again this year. And that seems to make sense, because teams are playing more coverage. They're playing, lighter fronts. We saw 21 personnel, 2 running backs, and 1 tight end on the field increase for the first time in a season from the year prior since 2006. So that's kind of where that came from. Is, teams started to play a little bit more heavier on offense, removing those 4 wide receiver sets. And we're only talking, like I said, 750 plays in a season, but going from 740 to 212, that shaves a huge number off. And what that in turn has done is made wide receiver ones more valuable again, because teams are condensing their packages and condensing their targets on the field. And it, in turn, lead targets gained more leverage on the field last year than they had in over the previous few seasons, when you were getting a lot more wide receivers on the field per offensive snap, which again, all these things kind of are cohesive and they inherently make sense. But that's kind of opened it up, and it made it's like, oh wow, wide receiver ones now had more leverage, where they were losing some ground. Even in the Cooper, like you go back to 2021, Cooper Kupp had an insane season. He had 190 targets, like accounted for all this production, and wide receiver ones as a group, like their leverage on the field wasn't very good. So seeing that kind of bounce back last year makes a lot of sense when you kind of congeal everything together. And again, following the current ADP, it makes you even swerve into more. It's like, well, taking these elite wide receivers does make sense.
Yeah, and it feels that way, like even when you're drafting. And I think we've talked about this before. It it really feels like after you get past and you can pick which wide receiver you feel the most comfortable about. But I've kind of put it at like wide receiver 11, like Garrett Wilson or St. Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Once you're getting past like those guys, the it all feels the same to me. Like it just all like I don't is Amari Cooper really that much different than Terry McLaurin, who's really that much different than Christian Watson? It doesn't, it feels really like there's this giant tier of second wide receiver 2 kind of guys. And so I want the elite wide receivers because I feel like there's going to be a gap. And some people will elevate, some wide receivers will elevate. Maybe Chris Olave is a guy that'll elevate. Maybe Jamar Chase gets hurt and T. Higgins becomes kind of an alpha fantasy receiver. That's definitely going to happen. We are really bad at predicting the future accurately. That's kind of the whole idea. But wide receivers were better at predicting the future. Wide receivers get injured at a lower rate than running backs. And I think that when you look at those, let's say top 11 guys, you feel a lot more comfortable with their target rates. I mean, even if Devontae Adams takes a 4% step back, he's still going to have a 29% target share, right? Like we feel much better with their target rates. We feel much better about their roles in the team. We haven't seen giant changes. Has anything changed for Buffalo except Dalton Kincaid? Stephon Diggs is still going to get a ton of targets because he's the guy that has to get targets, assuming, of course, he still plays for the Bills and he and Josh Allen don't hate each other. And so all of that kind of makes me think that's why I want to get these wide receivers early. The problem is, as you pointed out, everybody else thinks that as well.
Right.
And if this has just kind of been the way it's been, then maybe we should really start thinking about zigging. I haven't done a lot of that. I haven't kind of tried to go I haven't tried to go, super aggro running back. But the more I think about it, the more drafts I do, maybe that's the way to go, at least on a few teams, especially if you're a volume drafter, just because everybody thinks it's going to happen. And what fantasy football likes to do is to take the thing that everybody thinks is going to happen and go, LOL, y'all are dumb, and we're going to do something else. And so it's something I've just been thinking about. Do you have any kind of thoughts on the zagging a little bit based on what we're seeing, and especially these best ball tournaments?
Yeah, I think there's a couple elements in play. I think, like I said, I keep saying the current meta, but like I think it's inviting you, especially if you pick at the front of drafts, to go wide receiver, running back, because typically by the time you're picking in that second round, you've hit that firewall of guys you already named, that wide receivers. Those guys are gone, and then like, are you really going to be like taking T. Higgins as like the 2-3 turn over Nick Chubb, right? Like. So I think that it does invite you, the way the landscape is, to go at the front of drafts. Now, the back half of drafts, I think, is more interesting because you can double dip and take like 2 of those wide receivers before you hit that firewall. Or you could potentially, split the baby and take like an elite running back that has one of those guys that's in the small pool. Because the running back firewall is a lot earlier of like 3 down archetypes that like could be like ceiling breakers. So do you take 2 of those guys? Do you take one of those guys peppered in? I think that's where things become interesting. Is like that's where drafts, I think, are wide open. If you're picking like anywhere from like 6 through 12, it really opens up, I think, a lot of just a different avenues to take in terms of team building, because I do think there is a huge running back firewall. I love Nick Chubb, but like, is he like the type of archetype of running back that is potentially going to be the RB1? Like, probably not, right? Like, things have to run really hot for him. Like, he's going to have to score arguably 20 touchdowns to get there. Which is feasible, maybe like in a high end range of outcomes, but like it's not something you want to bet on, especially with now with a quarterback that can rush for some touchdowns and add some take away some any receptions that people think he's getting with just Jerome Ford being the RB2. But like Bijan Robinson, definitely you can talk yourself into like that outcome, right? But like Tony Pollard, you can talk yourself into that outcome, but like that's kind of where it ends at running back. So then when from an archetypical stance, it's really hard to say like I want to swerve and take some of these running backs when really none of them have that profile.
Yeah, like that becomes the issue, is that those running backs, I guess if you're picking like, I don't know, 10th in a 12-team league, you might have that opportunity. But then it becomes, you're right, like then we've run into the same problem running back, and we've run into it, as you say, much earlier. And there are even some of those guys I don't feel as great about Bijan touch upside as a rookie as others do. Could he do it? For sure. He's one of the better running back talents we've had in a long time, probably the best one to come into the league since Saquon Barkley. But, that team was giving carries to people that were worse than Tyler Algier and Cordero Patterson last year as well. And we saw Tyler Algier actually have a good season. Is he going to completely disappear? I mean, maybe Bijan Robinson's a better player than he is, and maybe that's just the way it's going to be. But I don't know, like you start to kind of poke holes in anybody, I guess, who's not Christian McCaffrey and Austin Eckler. And then even with Eckler, you look at
I mean,
last
you can
year and
poke
you go,
holes in those guys too.
exactly. That's what I'm saying. Even Eckler, you look last year and you go, okay, well, his target rate was inflated because all of their wide receivers are hurt. Now they have Quentin Johnson in there to kind of mitigate that, even if Mike Williams misses time, right? You look at San Francisco with Christian McCaffrey and the way they used him in the regular season when Elijah Mitchell was there, and he was more of a 15-touch running back than he was a 20-touch running back. And so if Elijah Mitchell stays healthy, which that, as we've seen early in his career, is a massive if. Unfortunately for my dynasty teams, I loaded up on Elijah Mitchell. I loved him, and that has gone poorly over the last 7 months. But here we are. But like if Elijah Mitchell is able to stay healthy and he's getting 7-8 touches, what does that do to McCaffrey? And so that's the other side of this is I can poke some holes in Devontae Adams. I can poke some holes in a few of those other wide receivers. I'm not really poking any holes in Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. And like at some point, like that just maybe that's just the way we have to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Any
it makes
thoughts?
it. I think it makes it fun though. It
Yeah,
keeps things open because you're still when we get into like your home leagues portion of the drafts and the general pop. I mean, you're gonna have guys that are just gonna do what they do. They're gonna take running backs high. You see that still more on FFPC than Underdog still as well too, and that's a full PPR site. But you only are forced to start 2 wide receivers in that format, which changes things. But yeah, I think we'll still see like when we get to the end of August, like the ADPs kind of bounce back a little bit for those guys. It's just more general population is drafting, but really kind of all the production and number trends kind of show that it's like running back is getting damaged in so many different ways for fantasy football from a top down perspective. And it's really wild because we've got an extra game, right? Like we have 17 games now and it's still falling off.
I I really like the home league aspect of this. That is my favorite thing at the end of August is to start to get texts from my friends. Hey, we're doing this, and they say, they're telling me how their drafts are going, and it's the most deeply confusing thing. I try to remind myself every year that these best ball drafts that we're doing in June are not reflective of what people are actually going to do in August. And I keep trying to remind myself every year, but still, I somehow end up shocked. I live in Texas, so there's always the draft that the guy's just going to take all the Cowboys. Like that is his goal in the entire draft. And so Dak Prescott will go in the 4th round, and you're like, hey, I guess that this is the way we're doing it. So this series is going to finish up. We've already got, if you're listening to this live, we've already got the quarterbacks, the running backs, the overall league look, and then the wide receivers went live. Tight ends are still to come. Do you have anything? Do you want to any nuggets, any previews you have for the tight end article that is going to publish on Friday?
I will say this, the tight end, like actually digging into the numbers, went in a different direction than I initially thought it would, looking back on last year, which was objectively looks from a top down perspective like a disaster. It just looked like did you have Travis Kelce? But looking at some of the league usage for tight ends, I think I actually became like more encouraged by the position and their usage last year and kind of the way they fit into way offenses are kind of counteracting the way defenses are playing. And I have a lot more optimism for the tight end position coming into this year. And I have a bunch of notes on that in the article. So that's just all I'll say, like vaguely on it.
Yeah, no, I can't wait to read it. All of these have been amazing. Like I said, you can go and read the overall offensive look back on sharpfootballanalysis.com. That is free for everybody. The positional outlooks, the positional look backs, those are part of our fantasy football draft kit. But you can get that draft kit for only $1, thanks to our friends over at Underdog. So go over to sharpfootballanalysis.com. There are instructions there about how to get that offer, get that promo. Definitely do it. $1 for all of Rich's amazing content. There's no reason not to do that. And you get to play on Underdog, which is a wonderful site. They have a great new it's been out for a couple of weeks, and Todd's been talking about it on the best ball. I don't know if you've been able to play any of these weekly winners drafts that they have going on.
I haven't done one
Hayden
yet.
Winks, actually. Friend of the podcast, Hayden Winks. I believe that this was his brainchild. And it's really interesting because unlike, we kind of get set on our strategies as a fantasy football drafters. And like we've been talking about here, this strategy in the meta has been, all right, we're going to take wide receivers early and we're going to do this. And building a best ball tournament roster, okay, we're going to have 2 quarterbacks, we're going to have 3 tight ends, we're going to have, 7 wide receivers and 5 running backs. I'm trying to do the math quick in my head if that actually works. But, that's the basic idea of what you do. This weekly winners is so interesting because you're trying to just win weeks instead of advance. And just trying to win weeks raises a lot of things you can do. I have been doing a lot of just 1 quarterback and 1 tight end, and then trying to build spike players around those quarterbacks and tight end, specifically if you can stack them, if you can get Mahomes and Kelsey, if you can get Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews, which is possible. That's a really interesting way to kind of build a fantasy football team. And weekly winners allows you to kind of explore the space a lot more than you're able to do in these best ball tournaments that have kind of, you can get a little weird in them, but have kind of become pretty standard in the way that they're done. And so love weekly winners, love Underdog. You can go deposit on Underdog and you can get our draft kit for $1. Perfect. It's absolutely perfect. We'll be back next week to talk about a little more of kind of Rich's, like I just think we should keep doing this, Rich. You've got so much interesting stuff coming out. I have no interesting stuff coming out. So we should just keep talking about all of the interesting things that you have coming out. But we'll be back next week on Thursday to talk about that. The Best Ball podcast will be back on Tuesday. Make sure you go and check that out. And we'll talk to you later.